Dearest fantasy readers, welcome to the Dear Fantasy Reader podcast, where two best friends, Hannah and Karen, travel through the pages of our favorite romantasy novels. Join us as we take flight into the world of the Empyrean series, diving deep into the chapters, exploring characters, scenes, theories, foreshadowing, and more, taking what we've learned from the second book, Iron Flame, to reread and re-experience the first.
With that, content warning and spoiler alert. We'll be covering anything and everything Empyrean series to this date and any content Rebecca Yarros has given us. So if you haven't read both already, save this podcast, go do that, and we will be here waiting when you are done. Also, due to the nature of these books, this podcast is rated R in content and in language.
As Rebecca Yarros says, readers who may be sensitive to these elements, please take note and prepare to enter Basgiath War College. First, we have some really exciting news to share. We now have a Discord group chat where we can continue the conversation, theories, and fun. We also have a giveaway going on our TikTok and Instagram for a folklore cardigan, Taylor Swift folklore cardigan, a Tortured Poets signed CD, signed by Taylor Swift herself, and copies of Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, provided by a Taylor Swift-inspired romance-only bookstore called The New Romantics. We are really trying to get the word out about our podcast because if people don't know about it, then they can't listen to it. If you would like to help us do that, give us a follow on socials and leave us a review. Reviews go so far. And on that note, we also got our first couple comments this week. And we happened to be together podcast planning yesterday when we saw them. And we literally squealed and then cried. And then we got one right before we started filming today. And really, it is like the best virtual warm hug that you guys could give us. So thank you.
I just have to read this comment from @MorallyGrayNails on Instagram. They said, OMG, just listened to both episodes. I love y'all, and I can't wait to hear your theories. My jaw dropped at some of the things you said, and you haven't even actually started yet.
It gives me all the feels. It's also so motivating to, at this point, as we're filming today, we've only launched our intro episode and our groundwork episode. So to already get this sort of response is more meaningful than we could ever put into words.
Seriously, we love it so much. Thank you.
Also, we had initially planned and told you guys last week that we were going to cover chapters 5 through 9 and Xaden's POV chapter 9, but I did not realize just how much we had to say about chapters 5 through 8, and we felt like chapters 9 deserved their very own episode. So we were going to skip a week in our schedule because Karen and I will be in London at the Eras tour on August 20th, but we were able to work it out to have the chapter 9's episode drop that day, so you guys don't have to go a week without. At least that's our current plan, and we will update you on our socials if anything about that changes. One other quick note, Karen and I are in an active tropical storm that is bordering a hurricane. So we will try our best to edit out the rain and thunder. You still may hear it. Fortunately, that is quite on brand for this book series, though. Now that we are all caught up on housekeeping things, time for a quick refresh of chapters 5 through 8 from our personal scribe informant, Karen.
Welcome to Battle Brief, one of the core classes Violet must take where the cadets are updated on some of the attacks on Navarre. Professor De Vera explains that a drift of griffins and their flyers attacked the village of Shakir on the Navarrian border the night before, and Wing Leader Xaden points out that they must be looking for something. Later, Violet prepares to take to the sparring mat for assessment day. She agrees to trade history lessons with Rhiannon, Riddick, and Sawyer for hand-to-hand combat training when suddenly Jack Barlow ruthlessly and meaninglessly kills a first-year student. Violet is paired with second-year Marked One Imogen for her assessment. Violet shames Imogen's dead mother, the one who Violet's own mother murdered. For this, Imogen attempts to kill Violet, but Mira's dragon scale armor saves the day. Violet does not make it out unscathed, though, as she is taken to the infirmary in the healer's quadrant by Dane with a broken arm and a dislocated shoulder. We meet Mender Nolan, a totally insignificant character, who has been mending Violet for the past 5 years. Dane once again tries to convince Violet to take the opportunity to run to the Scribe's Quadrant instead of being mended. But Violet, despite her pain, insists on staying in the Writer's Quadrant. Back at the barracks, Violet finds a note from Mira and her brother's journal, the Book of Brennan, which is her new guide to staying alive. In this book, Brennan shares how she can find out who her next challenge opponent will be, meaning the battle can begin before she even steps foot on the mat. Violet crafts a plan with the help of the Book of Poisons and a clever choice in breakfast duty. While collecting Fonnelly berries late one night, she is interrupted by an illegal assembling of the Marked Ones led by Xaden. Violet hides in the canopy of the tree, tucking herself within the shadows, listening in as Xaden gives the first year's advice on how to survive their training. Violet contemplates the situation and decides they aren't doing anything wrong until they discuss killing her. Xaden tells them that Violet is his to handle and sends them back to bed. When the coast seems clear, Violet sneaks out of the tree, but Xaden is waiting at the ready with a dagger and his badass shadow-wielding signet. Violet, sure that he is going to kill her, stands her ground by throwing daggers at him in warning. He flirtatiously compliments her as fascinating and violent. He asks her if she is going to tell anyone about his meeting, and she says that she won't, before feeling a strange scalp-prickling sensation. Wonder what that could be. Violet questions why he doesn't just kill her already, and in true Xaden fashion, he says, "It's no fun if you expect it." The next morning, Dane escorts Violet to breakfast duty, where she poisons her challenge opponent's scrambled eggs. Later in class, Violet learns about dragons, their weakening wards, and even a bit more about her brother's death. During sparring challenges, Violet defeats her opponent, Orin, who happens to fall ill during their match. Surprise, surprise. Over the upcoming week, she poisons her opponents enough to win each match. But when one is too ill to spar, Xaden steps in to fight or train her. Talk about a cliffhanger.
Literally a cliffhanger we left you off on by breaking up the chapter 9s. But
you're welcome.
It had to happen. It had to happen. There's so much in these chapters.
Yes, it had to be this way.
So, with that, time to join our riot as we take flight into our foreshadowing, analysis, and theories section. Now, this is where we are going to dive into the major plot points and moments in this section of chapters, sprinkling in foreshadowing and theories. It's a bit different than our last episode where we had separate sections, but the topics flowed best this way for this episode. We will still be asking our overarching questions at the end and going over the epigraphs. I have to say, I'm so excited for this episode because we found so much more than we expected. So buckle tight into your saddles because this is going to be a wild flight.
Yes.
These chapters were all about the classes that Vi has to take as a cadet, starting with Battle Brief. Now, Battle Brief is a class that the cadets take all 3 years where they talk politics, strategies, and recent and current battles. I loved this class and how it interweaves with their history. We don't get to see much of their history class. We get a lot of that from Violet herself. But this book engages so well with politics and propaganda and the dangers of manipulating history. Now, Rebecca Yarros was a history major and has specifically said that she wanted to play with these topics in this series.
I had no idea Rebecca Yarros was a history major, but it makes so much sense. And we can definitely see how her background in history comes to play, especially during a class like this.
Oh, absolutely. And I really loved listening to her talk about it. I will try and find the interview in my folder of her interviews and throw it in the show notes for you all if you would like to go listen to it. But I mentioned this in my intro episode. I am a political sociologist and I work in counterterrorism and violent extremism intelligence. So that is a lens that I often look through, especially in a series like this. This book is such a good introduction to people who may not understand the complexities of propaganda.
I totally agree. And especially when we get to Iron Flame and someone passes out the parchments that details the attacks that happened outside of Basgiath, and the professors called it fake and propaganda, even though we know it was very real.
Yeah, and I really liked that we got that contrast in Professor De Vera because Professor De Vera is actually who passed those out versus Professor Markham, where we find out that De Vera didn't know what was really going on with Navarre. She didn't know about the venom. She didn't know the extent, I guess, that Navarre was terrible, but she began to expect it. So she was the one who snuck the flyers into the class in Iron Flame, and once she found out, she joined the revolution. This is stark contrast where we see with Professor Markham, who was one of the propaganda masterminds, as if I'm understanding correctly, he is one of, if not the person that battle intel goes to before it even gets to the students or even the king. I will have to check myself on that, but I strongly recall that being the case.
I don't actually remember, but I think that you're correct on that.
We'll keep an eye out for it as we reread, but I'm pretty certain that that was the case. So in Battle Brief, Professor De Vera says that in the past, writers are seldom called into service before graduation. And if they were always third years who'd spent time shadowing forward wings. We learn in chapter 27 that Xaden and Emery, as third years, have been called to the Midland forts, quote unquote, countless times because the writers there had been called to the front as an emergency. Now, Violet tells Ree that this has been the case in the past from listening to her mother talk about it, but she, and specifically Dane, did not know that it was happening currently.
I'm just sure that bruised Dane's ego a little bit whenever he learned that there was information that he still didn't know.
Oh, absolutely, which we will get into when we get to that chapter, but for sure. We also learn in Battle Brief that Professor Markham was surprised to see Violet in class because she was supposed to be his star pupil.
Not anymore. That would be Jasenia now. And then on page 57, Professor Markham says, without accurate depictions of our front lines, reliable information with which to make strategic decisions, and most importantly, veracious details to document our history for the good of future generations, we're doomed not only as a kingdom, but as a society.
That line halted me in my tracks after a read of Iron Flame, because we find out in Iron Flame that he is the one that knows about the venom, and to some extent the terrible things that Navarre is doing. So he is actively, inaccurately documenting their history and spreading the propaganda. So it shows that even when people say these things, like they acknowledge the importance of history, that is its own form of propaganda.
Yes, this is exactly what is happening with them purposefully giving inaccurate depictions of history and what is currently happening. And it's odd going back and rereading this with the context of Iron Flame, because now I'm questioning every time they're in this class, what is even real?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much of it. And I think that that's kind of the thing that we experience that really is what Violet is experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of critique, I think to some extent valid, that Violet was really hard to read in Iron Flame. And I felt like this at first. But this whole thing where we're going back and we're like, oh, we don't really know. Well, imagine how she feels.
Oh my gosh, so true.
We were also introduced to lesser magics. that riders can channel from their dragons, like the pen. And I wish Violet used them more.
You know, now that you say that, I wish she did too. I don't think she really takes advantage of all of her magic, and I'm wondering if this could be because she hasn't spent her whole life dreaming of becoming a rider and dreaming of the power that comes with that. Like, while she was training to be a scribe, she wasn't dreaming of that.
Yeah, we don't really see a lot of the characters use lesser magic, though. Like, I suppose, and we'll talk about this in this chapter, we see, like, Imogen using speed. We see some, it's, like, talked about that they use the quill pens, and then they open doors and then the mage lights, but they could be doing cooler stuff. I don't know. It could be an intentional thing on Rebecca Yarros' part to, like, not, like, overly magic it. But
Yeah.
I love when it's consistently sprinkled in and they get to do all these cool things, because then I get to do all the cool things.
Yeah.
So.
And you said it in our first episode, you love a book with like powers and magic and everything. But what you said is true. Yeah. But what you said is true. There's so much to cover in these chapters. Maybe it was just like seemingly unimportant for her to talk about Violet using a pen. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that gets mentioned. I just would like to see, like, what other lesser magics are there. We get to know later that the Griffin Flyers have really honed their skills with lesser magics. And so I guess I think that that's really where things start to get brought up. And then Rebecca Yarros specifically said in an interview that Venin also have lesser magics. And so I wonder where we're setting up for it to be used more often, because it's not insignificant. Like, they come into play. So I just wonder if Violet will get better at them and then focus more on them. I guess she has this, like, huge, powerful signet that she needs to focus on, so she's not spending time really sharpening her skills. I don't know.
She's got to learn where to aim the lightning. She doesn't have time to practice with a pen.
That's fair, and maybe that's it. Maybe they don't have, but that's strange. Why do they not have a small class where they're honing lesser magics?
They actually do. Whenever they first start manifesting their signet, before they know where it is, whenever they start to have the power, they focus on that in the class where they are practicing their signets before it completely manifests.
And then the focus shifts to signets only that we know of. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on that. We were also first introduced here to the Griffins and the important information that sets up the whole Boromir Navarre issue. Dragons and Griffins, which are a cross between, like, half lion, half eagle, both channel power. However, dragons are the only ones who can channel power to the wards, which sole purpose is to block out all other magic but their own to protect the Veil. This is the reason that there is a war with Boromir, because when Navarre built the wards to protect themselves from the Venin, they left everyone else out. So Boromir is left almost defenseless against Venin outside of their Griffins and Flyers, and then they need the alloy daggers to kill the Venin. So that is why Xaden is having to supply them daggers, though he cannot supply enough, which means that they have to attack Navarre outposts to try and get the alloy to defend themselves.
Obviously, Violet doesn't know all this context, and at this point is just told that they are greedy assholes and are wrongly attacking Navarre for resources, but they're just trying to survive.
Yeah, and they're just desperate to protect themselves and their citizens who don't have the luxury that Navarrians do of blissful ignorance under the wards.
Privilege.
Yeah. And real quick, let's talk about the wards, because I've had quite a few friends ask me to explain this to them.
I am one of the friends. The wards are so complex, and I really want to wrap my brain around it to understand them better.
Yeah, well, as I understand them, the wards are a magical shield, an intangible wall similarly shaped like an umbrella. If you think of an umbrella, it has a center connecting piece. This is where the power radiates from and then extends outward in that somewhat circular shape to the outposts. They can only extend so far, and the area that it does extend to within the umbrella is very close to how Navarre established their borders, except it does not extend to Tirandor, which is seemingly why they rebelled. they're left unprotected. Now, Violet is explaining the nature of the dragons powering the wards and says that the power for the wards radiate from the veil, implying that the center of the umbrella is the veil because of the dragons. But we know now, after Iron Flame, that the center is the wardstone under Besgaiath, which is right by the veil. Violet doesn't know about the wardstone and its location yet, and she also doesn't know that the alloy is what strengthens the extended wards at the outposts. So when she's wondering why the wards are weakening in Battle Brief, it's because the Griffin Flyers are stealing the alloy to make daggers to protect themselves.
Oh.
At
Wow.
least to the extent that we know about them.
Yeah.
There's always room. We've got 3 more books to go that we will learn things that change that maybe a little bit. But as of right now, that's the new context we've gotten from Iron Flame. And Xaden knows this. So when he asks the condition of the village that was attacked at the end of Battle Brief, and Devera says it was not burned, he is described as saying they were looking for something with complete conviction. This seems like him attempting to clue the class into the fact that something bigger is going on and that they aren't as bad as everyone is taught to assume. Professor Devera even says that this class is where they learn which questions to ask. And I think that is him kind of indirectly training them to ask different questions.
Right. And Xaden specifically asked about the village and civilians, and this jumped out to me because he didn't ask a battle-specific question, and I just think that this kind of foreshadows that he has ties to the people beyond the border, but genuinely cares about the people.
That's a really good point because everyone else is looking at this as a very detached, disassociated conversation of just these battles happening somewhere. And here, right, his focus was on what was happening to the citizens. But I'm also a Xaden girly, so any chance to hype him
He
up,
can
I'm
do
gonna.
no wrong.
Truly, we'll get to that. We will get to that. Now, the Griffins, I have one more point to make on the info from Battle Brief. When first reading, I was confused about the significance of the altitude with the Griffins. I understand that they can't function well in high altitude, especially now that we know from Iron Flame, but when I first read, I got that. But I didn't understand why it would matter that it was a planned attack somewhere with high altitude. On a reread after Iron Flame, though, I think that this was to show that the Griffin Flyers were so desperate to get the daggers because of increasing venom attacks. They were forced to attack for them in a less than ideal place, but I still did not get the part about the Griffin Flyers knowing that the wards would fail unless they could connect that taking alloy weakens them. I'm not sure. That might be the case. We'll look out for it in future episodes as we read through, but
I'm a little confused too, and I definitely don't actually have any answers, obviously, because we only know what we know. Could it have actually been Venom attacking when it was blamed on the Griffin and their riders? Or, could the Griffins and their riders been trying to escape the Venom and then this attack happened and they were blamed?
I wondered that when I was first reading, but I think that might be part of why Xaden was asking the condition of the village, because the venom would have torn it to pieces, right? Like we see in Athbine. So I think at this point, I lean into this was actually them, because I thought on my first read, I thought, oh, all of this is venom. And we're just we just have the wrong people doing this. But then I realized it's more nuanced. The Griffin Flyers are doing it, but it's not in the bad way that we think or we're told to think at the first read.
Back to us being what is even real in these classes? What information do we believe and what do we not believe?
I do want to talk about one of the dragons in the Eastern Wing sensing the faltering ward. And that apparently is how the riot was already on their way to defend from Boromil's raiding party. This is significant because we get these small little insights into how some dragons have unique powers of their own, different from Indarna as a Feathertail. And this is one of those examples. I recall Garrick's dragon can sense runes significantly better than any other dragon, and maybe one that could sense venom. I can't as confidently say that one, but we'll keep an eye out for that on our rereads and to see if it's ever mentioned that another dragon has this higher sense, almost similar to a power. What really
Mhm.
confuses me about this is that Tarn is one of the most powerful dragons. How does he not have one of these unique gifts? Or does he? And he's just not telling Violet about it. And if that's the case, why?
Such a good question. Oh my gosh, he's so powerful, so he has to have one of these unique gifts. In my mind, there's no way he doesn't.
Yeah, by that logic, right? Being one of the most powerful.
Mhm.
Then that would probably mean that Sigale also does, and Coda. And maybe it's only something that you tell your writer as a
Yeah.
dragon. And we know that dragons are keeping way more secrets. They're bound to the Veil and the Empyrean. But if we're thinking from a battle perspective, or maybe it
Mhm.
just hasn't come up yet, or maybe somehow he doesn't know, like when do these, like, I don't know how old Garrick's dragon is, but Taryn's middle age, like at what point, we see that time does things for signets, it does things for bonds, specifically mating bonds, because eventually Taryn and Sigale will be able to communicate through their minds across any distance, whereas we don't see that now. So maybe it's like that
Oh,
eventually he will find out what his special power is. But I just don't think that, I don't know. There's so much to that.
yeah. And if he does know and he's keeping it a secret from Violet, that makes me nervous because this could push Violet to be even more angry because everyone is keeping information from her.
Yeah. And it's not just once, right? She's not like, okay, you
Yeah.
kept this for me. Now come clean and then we'll be good. Like she tries with Zayden. But like you'd think with Taryn, especially with how betrayed he felt from Sigale keeping Zayden's signet a
Mhm.
secret, I just, it's so strange. And I get, zooming out our writer's, author's perspective, it makes sense that some characters in this situation have to keep things from each other because then it would spoil things for us. And it's
True.
just not time for us to know about it yet. So Violet can't know about it yet. But that just seems like one of those things that would just be like a character flaw in Taryn that I just
Uh-huh.
can't see matching up. I don't know. Again, so
Right.
much to that. Jack in Battle
Uh,
Brief is being the typical condescending asshole per usual. But he says something that confuses me. He says that General
okay.
Melgren knows the outcome of a battle before it happens, but even he doesn't know when it will happen. And he's saying that as a dig to Violet. But then that got me thinking. In Iron Flame, General Melgren sees an attack on Samara coming. He says, quote, I've seen it. They come for us on solstice and they win. So he sees when the battle happens. Now, he's wrong about the location because of the Marked One's relics, but he was still right about the day. So he can see when it happens. I wonder, like, if this is just an inconsistency or Jack is just underinformed, or maybe not, it's not super well known the extent of his signet.
That Jack is probably just underinformed. He's so arrogant, so it makes sense that he thinks he knows everything, but obviously he doesn't.
That's true. And I guess it would fit with us also not being able to know the extent of everything. But it felt like one of those lines that was supposed to give us information through him just being rude. And so
Mm.
then that just gives us misinformation. Maybe your signet can keep expanding the longer. Like, I don't know how old General Melgren is. And writers usually don't live but a couple more years. But then General Sorengale lived long enough to see all of her children, but her youngest, join the Writers' Quadrant. So is it that if you rise in the ranks as a writer, you get to stay
You have a better
alive?
chance. Yeah. And it's not a given that the riders will die during their active duty, but it's very, very possible. So the ones that have risen in the ranks are probably the best of the best,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why they're alive.
Yeah, that's true. It's just been overemphasized to us that you really don't expect to live long, not even
Yeah.
just as like in the writer's quadrant, but outside of that. So it is strange. But he did give us what I think might be a bit of foreshadowing. Jack says, quote, "I'm not the one who thinks precognition is a thing," end quote. So this is a very Rebecca Yarros nature line that will likely come back up. I know some people have theorized that Violet's second signet is a form of precognition, or that Andarna has a dragon gift of precognition, similar to the dragon that was able to sense the faltering wards, which we'll explore in depth when we get to our season on Iron Flame. But I think someone is going to have this signet, and I'm super excited to see how it plays out if they do, especially since everyone thinks it's not real.
Just to make sure I'm understanding right, precognition is seeing the future, right?
That's my understanding. And I think that that can come in different, like, there's different levels, as you see with an intrinsic, seeing intentions versus like maybe you see precognition like with a date attached or like a flash, or you can see like full out. It's an umbrella, but basically seeing
Yeah.
the future. Yeah. Which, this makes me wonder if Navarre has intentionally made people believe that precognition is not a signet that is real or has ever existed. Similarly to intensics, though they're murdered. So, like, people know they exist, but they understand why they're murdered. It could be an extremely useful weapon for Navarre, though, similar to how they plan to use Danes. But I could see them being afraid of what someone who couldn't be controlled would do with it. But then I wonder if that person would be able to see any assassination attempts coming. So then they wouldn't be able to get assassinated. There's so much to think about.
It's so true. I mean, Professor Melgren can see the outcome of a battle, so technically that's like a form of precognition. But if someone was just to have like that so Raven vision moments, I'm not sure that they would allow them to live.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I hadn't thought about how Melgren's is a sense of precognition. It's a variation of it, right? It is under that
Mm-hmm.
umbrella.
Right.
So then we know it exists. So it's such a strange line for Rebecca specifically to include, even if Jack's misinformed, but like, why include it at all?
But he even mentioned Professor Melgren anyways, whenever he said, I'm not the one who thinks that precognition is real.
Oh, okay. Wait. Yeah, you're right. So he is saying that he can see the outcome, but he can't see when. So I think that they're explaining that precognition is specific to like a timestamp, almost like
Gotcha.
what date. Okay. Yeah. So there's variations that we go with, but what they seem to be classifying it here is
Right.
what day it happens.
Exact days and times. And
Yeah. Because Melgren is technically seeing the outcome of something that happens in the future. Yeah. That's going to come back. It's got to come back. Similarly to this, the gods are mentioned so frequently. Both Malik, the god of death, and Dune, the goddess of war, are mentioned in this stretch of chapters. They have to come into play in some more significant way, right?
I think so. I think we're going to learn more about them.
Like it does set up like the society and their beliefs, but it's mentioned so much. It just has to come up.
And in other fantasy books I've read, I'm not going to tell you which ones because maybe we'll read them someday, but there is a lot of talk about the gods and like specific gods, and it never comes into play. So, like you said, it could just be setting up like the beliefs that they have, like that kind of thing.
Sprinkling in some more fantasy. And yeah, that makes sense. So after Battle Brief, Rhiannon comments that Violet knew every answer in history and every question to ask in Battle Brief. Not only is this showing us how smart Vi is, her strength of mind, but it also shows just how brainwashed she is by all of this propaganda. She has so much false knowledge that she clings to for sanity, and it has almost all been manipulated. As she replied, she was trained to be a scribe, trained to think like this. This was definitely setting us up for the extent that Violet's world would be rocked at the end of Fourth Wing and throughout Iron Flame. Her entire world was flipped upside down, even more so than anyone around her who hadn't almost committed their entire life to learning and continuing to spread that propaganda.
And it makes so much sense and adds a bit more context why she is so angry with Xaden and Iron Flame for not being 100% truthful for her. She already feels like everything she's ever been taught was a lie. Xaden's not being truthful with her. People are keeping secrets from her, and she just doesn't know what to believe.
Yeah, she's angry at the world, but she's also partly responsible to save it because of how powerful she is. I think that's going
Right.
to be a huge part of the beginning of Onyx Storm, her contemplating that responsibility.
Oh, I can't wait. Well, jumping right into our sparring assessment day, we are officially introduced to sparring class. And sparring is just practice fighting, but without using magic and sometimes no weapons. You're learning to fight techniques and honing in your skills with your weapons. Although at Basgiath, it is much more than practice. On assessment day, professors are learning your baseline skills. And as classes go on, cadets are purposefully matched up with each other to weed out the weak. And many of the cadets get injured and sometimes even die on that map.
Yep. And in contrast to Battle Brief, we learn just how unprepared Violet is for the sparring mat and the challenges, especially without her daggers on assessment day. As Emetario said, no blades during assessment. Now, Rhiannon even assumed that Violet would be a hand-to-hand threat as a Sorrengail, and we find out that Mira had been training for 12 years at the point of her assessment, so since she was 8, and Violet only had 6 months.
My niece is about to turn 8, and I cannot imagine her training for something so intense starting in 2 months. And we kind of knew that the sparring wouldn't be Violet's strong suit, but I don't think I realized how underprepared she actually was. And I guess this is because she scored so high in speed and agility. I thought that this would have helped her out more.
That's true. I think also she's 20 years old, and as someone who I hone my skills more in my mind than I do physically, to be thrown into that so suddenly when your body is just unprepared, like you can be quick
Mhm.
sometimes in one moment, but she's made in sparring class every day to be physical, quite physical, and especially having a chronic illness, that is even more difficult than an able-bodied person. So I think that context is important, but we really
Yeah,
are hit with reality in this class of her situation and her experience.
that is so true. We do need to take into account that she is quite breakable and just can't do certain things. That's okay. She has strength in other areas, but it
Yeah,
does make sense. And especially with only having 6 months to train.
exactly. That's why it's so important that people are putting their efforts and energy into training her and helping her succeed, which we will get back to in just one moment. Speaking of, but on a different point, I highlighted the line that said, quote, "Thank God Dane's shirt is on because I don't need another distraction when it's time for my turn." I forgot that Dane was supposed to be hot. I'm so
Oh,
serious. I highlighted that line and I was like, wait. And it makes sense. Like, I just forgot how into him she was. Like, I knew it was like a flirty, like, oh, maybe one day. I did not know. Like, she,
oh my gosh. I forgot he was hot too. That is so funny. But I think that we might have forgotten that he's supposed to be hot because we're so turned off by his personality.
absolutely, 100%, 100% is. Also, this is the only time I think Violet says God singularly. She usually always says thank God's plural. Is this an inconsistency? I don't know. I don't know.
Unfortunately, I think it's probably just an error that got missed in the editing process. I think you're right. I'm pretty sure that's the only time she says God singular, and then every other time she says gods.
And everyone else says gods. So
Right.
yeah. Sorry if that bothers some of you. It was bothering me, so I had to share.
I completely missed it, so maybe it didn't bother you.
And now it does because I brought it up. Again, sorry. One moment I did love in this chapter was where Riddick, Ree, and Sawyer agree to help train Vi if she helps them with history. This is the chosen family shit I love to read.
Yes, I love this chosen family moment. And especially when a character isn't super close to their family or, like, is separated, like they can't be near them like Violet is right now.
Unfortunately, this moment of reader bliss was cut short by fucking Jack snapping the neck of a cadet he was sparring with.
And on assessment day too. That's so evil.
To put this in perspective, this was quite jarring for everyone, even Professor Imitario, which really, again, reminds us that these first years are new to the horrific nature of this quadrant, and even the sparring professor, someone who has seen plenty of it, is still affected. Now, it's re-emphasizing to us readers and to Violet how brutal the quadrant is as a whole, and how she could very easily lose her life on the sparring mat that we were just introduced to.
It raises the stakes.
It does. Just another one of those moments that really is showing us she wasn't kidding. Rebecca Yarros did not come to play. Now, Professor Imitario says something that it has not left my mind since my first read. He says, quote, "You don't have to get used to it. You just have to get through it." Whew.
Oh,
so I've briefly mentioned this before, but I work in counterterrorism and violent extremism intelligence, which, if you don't know what that is, simply put, I try to stop really bad people from doing some of the most terrible things that people can do to each other. It can be graphic, and all of it is horrific. And my mentor once told me, quote, "You never get used to it, but in order to help people, sometimes you just have to be able to work through it," which is not easy. But if you want to protect people, for Violet, if you want to stay alive and protect the people that she cares about, you have to some extent, be able to mentally work through it.
Wow.
Yeah, and in the context of the story, this line is super significant because for Violet and all of the writers, that's what she's forced to do, even though it doesn't have to be this way. Navarre is doing this to them. But Violet does say later that it is preparing her to deal with the death in the midst of the battle.
I feel like all of this is setting us up. And we talked about this last week, how much death and gore kind of is ahead of us in these books.
Yeah, well, and I mean, to some extent, I really appreciate Rebecca Yarros' perspective on death. But importantly, she has continuously told us not to trust her and that our hearts will be broken in this next book. Now, that makes me a little hesitant for my mental health. I might need to make sure I'm in a place for Onyx Storm when it releases. But she also writes these really lovable characters that I'm so grateful to be able to experience for whatever brief amount of time we have them, i.e. Liam. But that's another chapter. I'm not ready to talk about it yet.
That is a really beautiful perspective, though. Like, I really appreciate that, and I'm going to try to keep that perspective moving forward.
It's hard. It's not easy. You just have to learn to push through it.
Really quick, before we jump in with Violet's sparring match, I have to mention on page 64, Dane tells Riddick to stop pulling his punches because it does a disservice to Orly, and then goes on to talk about the Cygnus and the Northeast border aren't going to give her any quarter because she's a woman. They'll kill her just the same. This made me irrationally angry because he's literally doing that to Violet.
I think this is why the allure of his supposed hotness was cut short for me. When I saw how differently he treated Violet on the mat compared to Orly and also Ree, he encouraged Ree, pointed out that holding back on the mat is actually going to get them killed because they can't learn and hone the skills they need that way. And for Dane, he's completely blind to this himself when it comes to Violet, which I know there is emotion involved, but damn, is it frustrating to read.
Can you not hear yourself? That you're not doing her any favors. Xaden has said the same thing to Dane about Violet.
Yeah.
I can't. Moving on from this man who makes us so frustrated. Violet is paired against Imogen, who is a second year and who is also one of the children of the Separatist.
I have really grown to love Imogen, but you weren't supposed to like her at first. And I have thoroughly enjoyed seeing their friendship evolve. This hasn't really crossed my mind with a lot of characters, but when I was reading her here, I will not be okay if she dies.
I won't either. I will be very unwell. Ugh, especially with this redemption arc she's gotten for us.
Back to this book. Like living in the future over here. Imogen tells Violet, you really should dye your hair if you don't want everyone to know who your mother is. You're the only silver-haired freak in the Quadrant. Now, this gave me pause because General Sorrengail does not have silver hair herself. So I assume that this means that people know she has a daughter with silver hair, but even Violet said that most people forget that she exists and think that General Sorrengail only had one daughter. And we know Mira is well known because of her award, so they weren't assuming Violet.
I'm really glad you brought this up. Because whenever I was rereading the chapters for this week, I was like, wait, General Sorrengail does not have silver hair. How does everyone know whose daughter she was from her hair color? I guess I'm just wondering, is it common knowledge that General Sorrengail was sick whenever she was pregnant? Because isn't that the explanation we get to why she has silver hair? Maybe that's common knowledge?
Yeah, or, maybe it was also, word probably spread quickly once the first person said there was a Sorrengail in the Quadrant, and then there was probably gossip, and it likely got out, oh, she's got silver hair. So it was like, if she was just like a standard blonde or a standard brunette, you wouldn't immediately know, but she is so unique in that people immediately know, like when they describe what she looks like to others. Maybe it's just that insignificant.
Word
but
travels fast.
Yeah, that felt... So Violet's response to this, though, boy, I do not blame Imogen for trying to kill Violet either. Violet says that, quote, I am proud of her mother, her service to protect our kingdom from enemies both without and within. Implying that Violet is proud of what General Sorrengail did to Imogen's quote-unquote traitorous parents, murdering them. This was not a good look on Vi on a reread.
It's true. It's definitely not a good look for her. But she only knows what she's been taught. But even still, to say something like that to someone who had to watch their family die at the hands of your mother...
I don't know if Violet knows at this point they were forced to watch.
True.
But that's nuts. She's doing the same thing that other people are doing, which I guess shows growth, right? Assuming that the children are also traitorous, bad, right? That they did something wrong, when in reality, these were their parents' quote-unquote crimes, because we know that they actually had very good intent. They just weren't organized and were doing it in maybe not the best ways. Maybe it's meant to show that. And she does say she's trying to make her angry to be able to use as an advantage on the mat. And I guess I can get past it for Violet, but it was very much so like an out of character, at least the character she turns into later moment. Because she starts to see this shift to the point where she tells Mira, like, don't fuck with my friends.
Right.
when Mira
You love
assumes that there's
growth.
somehow. So yeah, I get it. She couldn't start out that perfect,
Yeah.
but still bothered me. Now,
Yeah.
understandably, Imogen then tries to kill Violet, and I think I'm confused about something else.
Okay.
Violet thinks that Imogen is, quote, so damn fast, and Dane says, you can't use your powers in here, Imogen. I am assuming that this is a lesser magic, as Dane has said in previous chapters that as for lesser magic, powered through the bond of my relic, I can do the typical stuff like open doors, crank up my speed, and power ink pens instead of using those convenient quills. So I suppose speed is just a lesser magic that Imogen has really honed her skills in, but the way that they refer to it as her power here seems different.
Oh my goodness. You cannot read these books once and just keep moving on. I don't think it's possible because you can't catch everything in just one read of these books. And I actually didn't even put this together in my second read. But I forgot that her signet, which we later learn is recent memory erasing. I think whenever I first read it, I was like, oh, she must be using her signet. No, she had to have been using the lesser magic. Wow.
You know what? You might be onto something. I think that's probably why it was worded the way it was, to make you assume that her power was that. But then, like, there was no big reveal that I recall. Like, her signet of mind wiping has been so underutilized that we know of.
Right.
Because
maybe we just don't remember.
How many times has she done this? And someone asked Rebecca Yarros in an interview if Imogen had erased Violet's memories in Fourth Wing, and she said something to the effect of, isn't that an interesting thought?
The way she worded that.
That's how she does it. That's how she gets away with it. But it's so smart on her part because it could go either way. Like, it's an interesting thought, but she's not insinuating, yes, that happened. It kind of leads that way. But also, I'm going to use that later. You know, like...
Wow. It's an interesting thought. She said, I'm giving you nothing.
Oh, and she's so good about that. But then she throws out these things in her interviews that are just like, okay, that's context I'm logging for later.
For people like you, and I think there are a lot of people like you that deep dive, like watch the interviews, like look up the theories.
Transcribe the interviews.
Right. And yeah. I think that people like me, I so easily miss stuff like this. So that's why this is so fun. I love finding out all the things and thinking of things that I didn't actually ever think of before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on. We already know that the marked ones want Violet dead, but Imogen trying to kill her was the first time one of them actually made the move to attempt that.
See, and that's what you're really good at because I didn't connect that.
And we'll see it. We'll see not marked ones. We'll see a bunch of people.
I do want to take one moment to talk about, and I don't know if you've read this, and you should because it's good. Okay. But there is a Xaden point of view fanfic that is so good. So good. Let me find the name of it really quick.
I have never read that or heard of it.
It's amazing. It's written by Belle, BELLE _BB, so BEEBEE. We'll link it in the show notes. They wrote it before Iron Flame came out, so it's not entirely accurate, of course, and it's not canon. It's a fan fiction. But they have this really cool scene in it where Xaden gets onto Imogen with Garrick present for attacking Violet in the way that she did. Now, even with the context of Iron Flame, I think that actually probably could have been the case, especially because the next, and we're about to get to this, the next conversation we hear about it is with the Marked Ones meeting, and someone asks, when can we kill Violet? And Imogen goes, yeah, when can we kill her? So I feel like that probably happened, and you're saying it's the first Marked One to do it, and she was reprimanded by Xaden. We also know he was tasked with keeping her alive, and that probably would not have turned out well for Xaden had Imogen actually been successful. But I just wanted to throw that in there. It is incredible. It is so good, and I cannot wait for them to release Iron Flame in Xaden's POV.
Ooh, I need to read this. Is it an entire book?
It's the whole thing, and it is yummy.
Oh my goodness.
The whole thing is
yummy. I'm excited.
Yes. And now the fan fiction author knows what they do. So they're going to be making some informed guesses, of course, adding their own creativity through it, of Xaden using his signets, which is another part of the book that I really loved. The fan fiction is that he gets to use his signets of shadow wielding to like hear conversations, and it's cool. It's cool. All right, moving on.
Moving on to chapter 6, and I have to talk about the epigraph because this epigraph talks about the importance of menders, and we see in this chapter pretty immediately that they are super important. And last week we talked about how Violet usually forces herself to push through the pain that she's experiencing. And then here she says that she cannot push through this pain. So that shows how bad this injury actually is.
Yeah, I was really confused by this whole conversation, even in my recent reads. Like it's this whole back and forth, because at first you're assuming that Violet wants to be mended to not show that she's quote unquote weak, but then later says she's not going to be mended because that would show she was weak and needed. That's like but your point still stands. The fact that it got this bad on the first day of assessment.
Yeah. When Winifred called for Nolan to come mend Violet, Dane begs them not to mend Violet so that he can get her into the Scribe Quadrant as a late entry. Dane, just let it go. I've said it before. I must say it again. Dane is my public enemy number 1.
Okay. All right. If you're watching on YouTube, you could probably tell by my face just a moment ago. Is it bad that I don't even want to talk about Dane? In this scene specifically, especially, but like in general, it's just not as fun because he's so frustrating.
He's so frustrating.
He gets better, but not here.
No. And this chapter specifically is so frustrating because you want her to be in more pain. Also, like, don't mend her. No, can't.
Yeah, I did love when Winifred called him out saying, "Make yourself useful, boy." Because that is consistently my issue with Dane. He has all this concern, some valid, I will give him that, and all this effort to push Violet out of the quadrant when that isn't actually helping her. It is hindering her. His own point that he just made on the sparring mat right before the scene. She's so busy fighting him, trying to make him hear her when she needs to be focused on training and preparing, and he should be training her.
Right. If he would have taken all of this energy of trying to get her out and just trying to prepare her, where would she be at this point?
Probably not super far at this point, but
but like maybe she would have been more prepared.
Absolutely. Here we also meet Nolan, who is a mender and has been mending Violet for the last 5 years. Now, Violet has needed mending since birth due to her chronic illness, and because it is 5 years specifically, this made me wonder if her brother, Brennan, who is also a mender, as we know, was mending her before Nolan was.
I have not thought about that. He very well could have been if they were stationed near him. But when did they move to Basgiath War College? When did Violet move there? Because maybe Nolan's just been mending her since they were stationed there.
That's an interesting thought, because that would mean, if it's the case and it was 5 years ago, that they moved to Basgiath the same year that Brennan was killed, quote unquote.
Now, do we know where Brennan was stationed before he
Not
passed?
off the top of my head. He doesn't really give a lot of information, but we can check.
Yeah.
There's also this really cool wiki. It's called the Empyrean series wiki that gives a canon events timeline, I believe is what it's called. We'll link it also in the show notes. But I'll be checking that to see if it's mentioned. It's pretty comprehensive, as I understand it.
Oh, well, we'll check it out. To go look at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have another question about menders, and that you may know the answer from all your extensive research or the wiki page. We know that healers don't have magic, and they have to abide by certain rules, so they're limited. And menders are riders with the rare signet that allows them to use magic to heal people and are only bound by the rider's codex. I'm wondering what the mender's limitations are, because Nolan walks with a cane. And is this something that he could fix? Because someone loses a tooth in the sparring assessment.
Ooh.
And they're
okay, see where you're
sent to
going.
they're sent to the healers and menders because they said nobody should lose a tooth during assessment.
Ooh, okay. I love this question. My understanding is that based off of the line in this chapter and Violet's comments about Sawyer's leg at the end of Iron Flame, they can fix, restore, and return anything back to its original state if they have all of the quote unquote items. In your example, if that person took their tooth to a mender, then they could likely restore it. But at least where we left off in Iron Flame, Sawyer did not have his leg to reattach. So they can't grow things back for someone, which gets into my theory about it not being possible for a mender to mend a soul that has been exchanged to become venom, because that piece is no longer theirs, which begs the question of whose it is, and that's another theory. But to your point about Nolan walking with a cane, menders cannot heal themselves. That we know of, okay? It could be that over time, menders can start to as their signet ability grows, or the more powerful the dragon. Who knows? But this is why Naolan, Taryn's first rider, who was a siphon, had to siphon Brennan's power from him in order to use it on him to save Brennan's life.
Oh, wow. To have the ability to mend other people but not be able to mend yourself, and knowing how rare that signet is, it would be so difficult for me, and that's probably a little bit selfish, but that's kind of where my mind goes.
I had not thought about that.
Because I don't think they're going to put two menders in one place, so if something happens to that mender...
Well, then also think, first of all, that has to be hard on the mind. And then think about what that meant for Brennan. But the topic of menders' abilities and limitations is something I did want to talk about. As the full quote says, quote, they, menders, have the power to fix, to restore, to return anything to its original state, from ripped cloth to pulverized bridges, including broken human bones. This line, only 70 pages into the first book, was setting us up for Brennan being able to mend the Wardstone at the very end of Iron Flame. This is the kind of Easter eggs that makes dissecting and theorizing this series so fun.
And that is something that I never would have put together. Oh my gosh.
Somehow I missed it on my first read. I skipped entirely over that part. So when I was in Iron Flame, I was thinking he's not going to be able to mend Wardstone because they can only do that to like humans. I thought of them as like human healers less than any item mender. So I didn't realize the extent of that ability. So it really stood out to me on this reread, and I had to throw it in.
Oh, it's such a good point.
Wow. Something else that stood out to me on this reread was when talking about Brennan being a mender, Violet thinks that, quote, he would have become one of the greatest had he lived. We now know that he did live, and he is one of the greatest because he was able to mend the broken Wardstone. And if my theory is off or wrong and a soul can be mended, this sets up Brennan to be the mender capable of doing that. Xaden?
I hope this theory is true with all of my heart.
That might be too easy, but who knows? Probably only Rebecca Yarros and her editor at this point.
It's not too easy, Rebecca. It's okay.
Yes,
I'll
please
forgive you. Just fix Xaden.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Okay.
We won't go there yet. We won't go there yet. We
Mhm.
also get a glimpse into Nolan's perspective. He is very much so pro-Navarre, but he did say that he was against conscripting the marked ones as punishment for their parents' sins, saying that he suspects the point of them being allowed to join the Riders Quadrant was because most of them would not survive as cadets. Think parapet, think how brutal it is, like nobody really usually survives. So that gives us room to assume that this was truly the reasoning for why Navarrian leadership, specifically General Sorngale, rationalized and allowed them to join.
Yeah, he's definitely pro-Navarre. And isn't he the one that turned in Violet when she had the books that they stole from the king's personal archives? I don't think he's bad because he took compassion for the marked ones and didn't think they should be punished for what their parents did. I think he's just another person who's been fooled by the propaganda.
Absolutely agree. Because that's where my
Right.
mind went. I really wanted to understand because I thought he was going to be a good guy. Like, I thought he was going to
Mhm.
be one of the ones that were just inherently good. And I could see why he would be trying to mend Jack's soul instead
Yeah.
of giving up hope on him because of that goodness. And that may still be the
Mhm.
case. So I was really floored when that happened and he did turn on Violet. And this set up for that. It
Mhm.
did. It set up reasoning for it a whole book before.
Ugh. I don't want to think about it too much because I don't want him to be bad. I do want him to have that goodness and compassionate. We're going to believe that.
I don't think Violet likes him now, though. Like,
Yeah.
now that she's got PTSD from her interrogation and he's connected to it, we got hints in Iron
Oh,
Flame that she doesn't want to be near him and it's triggering
oh,
for her. So
100%. He turned her in and he caused her to get interrogated, and that was him. He could have prevented that from happening, and that seeing that from her perspective too is no, not a friend. Anyway, speaking of friend, Violet is fighting with Dane about staying in the Riders Quadrant while essentially being drugged from whatever pain medication. And this made me giggle because of the way she was slurring her words. She's like, I am not going back to the subs. Subs. Subs.
I was also giggling reading this. And then I love to listen to the graphic audio version. And they did a fantastic job. And I thought this was just really cute. I
Yeah,
love how it was written like in the text for us as readers to really
right.
get a sense of. I loved it. It was so good.
With a bunch of R's, and she's like slurring her. Yeah.
It's so cute.
And then when Violet makes her way back to the barracks and Rhiannon jumps and says, "You're here," and she's just so relieved that Violet's okay. It's just another moment of their friendship, and I love to see their friendship. And I will say it 1,000 times throughout this podcast.
Same. Same.
And then Violet finds the Book of Brennan. This was such a special gift Mira left for Violet, and it just shows how much love Mira has for her baby sister and that she knows that Violet can survive.
Absolutely. And I think this was brilliant on Mira's part because she
Mhm.
was so focused on getting by across the parapet. And a single extra book could have been enough to throw her off balance. And if Mira hadn't kept the book, Violet could have very well died crossing the parapet and it would have been lost forever or dropped it even. So for Mira to think to keep it safe until she was sure Vi had made it across and thought of a plan to get it to Violet was brilliant. And I do want to comment on how a scribe is who snuck this book into Vi's room, and I want to know which scribe. Which scribe knows about the Book of Brennan?
You always think of questions that I've never even considered or questioned myself. Could it have possibly been Jasenia? Maybe Mira knew her too?
That's fair,
Yeah.
but I feel like we would have gotten confirmation that it was Jasenia later on, if so.
Right.
It's honestly, it's likely insignificant to the actual story, but it
Right.
just makes me curious. So scribes are not seen there much. That would have been
Right.
suspicious activity. I don't know.
Or maybe she instructed a scribe to not look at it and they just listened because, like, let's be real. Would you cross Mira Sorrengail? I wouldn't.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm actually more afraid of Violet, I think, if I'd ever crossed someone, which is saying a lot because Mira's who everyone's afraid of at first, right?
Right. Now you
Now,
wouldn't cross Violet.
yeah, that's true. I also noticed an endearing parallel in Mira's note to Violet about the book and the note that Brennan wrote for Mira. Brennan ends his note to Mira writing, "You have to live because Violet is watching. You can't let her see you fall," using Violet to motivate Mira. Similarly, Mira ends hers to Violet writing, "I know he'd want you to have it. He'd want you to live," doing the same with Brennan for Violet.
Ah, I love these sibling dynamics, and it leads me to believe that they were all pretty close before Brennan's death.
I definitely feel like we got a lot of context about that for Brennan and Mira and how Violet was kind of like, at least felt like she was always the outsider of
Mhm.
the three. But I think this brings it a little more full circle.
Right.
It's just so sweet.
Oh, and Violet is so smart with this book and using the information and her mind to get an
Hmm.
extra leg up on everybody else.
I do also want to add that the Book of Brennan set me up to have such high expectations for his character. I remember thinking to myself that I wish he wasn't dead because he seems like such a good character and would be so incredible to read. And I actually don't really care a ton for him. And maybe that's because we haven't like fleshed him out anymore in Iron Flame, but
Yeah,
mm,
I also want to love him, but for me, it's a struggle because thinking of my siblings, I would be so angry if my brother had kept the fact that he was alive for 5 years a secret when my entire family thought he was dead.
I think that might be why I don't have like a super strong bond to his character
Mhm.
because bond, like the scene at the beginning of Iron Flame, which we can talk more about when we get there, we didn't get a lot of emotion from him toward Violet or like him really feeling bad for doing this or like really explaining anything else. And there's got to be a reason for that. And it will probably come into play in later books. But like as of right now, I don't feel like the brotherly love that you
Mm,
got from this book through this book. That's pretty meta.
yeah.
But Violet thinks to herself, quote, "I know mom will toss it in the fire if she ever finds it," end quote. I want to know more about this. What is this tradition for the burning of the books of the dead? I want to know what the consequences are or what they're afraid will happen if they don't burn all of their loved ones' things, right? Is it true, whatever they're afraid of? Or is it just superstition? I think it's either going to come to pass that something Violet needed was burned in the name of this tradition, or there is a consequence if you don't burn all of the things of a loved one that Violet will find out about or face.
Oh my gosh. So I did not think about this tradition being because they might fear something. Maybe it's their fear of Malik, but I didn't think of it being like anything that could be a fear, could be a superstition, but I kind of like the fear theory. Like they're doing it because they're afraid of something.
That honestly was my first assumption. I also assume that it's connected to Malik because of he
Mhm.
is the god of death, so it must be some tradition that is in his name, right?
Right.
I think there's got to be a consequence, otherwise it wouldn't be so important to do it. Or it comes up that resurrection is a thing and Navarre does not want people being resurrected. And you have to have something that someone owned to resurrect them. And so when someone dies, you have to burn all their belongings. Like there's so much. I
Wow.
don't know. I just came up with that off the top of my head. I don't. There's there's so much.
That one.
There's so much in there. But I'm just gonna quickly throw this out to cause even more chaos.
Oh
I
gosh.
wonder if Violet's mom burned all of her father's personal belongings and possibly some of his research. This wouldn't be as fun to read because I want to know what he found in his research.
Yeah.
Also, this likely means that Violet will need to go through her mom's personal belongings, whatever isn't confidential that is, at the beginning of Onyx Storm. We will get
Okay.
more into that in later episodes.
Yes. I had a thought, but I'm going to save it for when it comes up in Iron Flame. So, yeah. Violet is so smart with the Book of Brennan and is using this information to get an extra leg up on everybody else. And then that brings us into Violet sneaking out every night for 9 nights in a row to build her personal arsenal of poisons with her handy-dandy copy of the Book of Poisons.
I loved reading this chapter. I'm so excited to talk about it, especially now that we know both of Xaden's segments.
So good. While hiding, Violet says she was sticking to the shadows that wrap around me, and this made me wonder if this was, again, foreshadowing what Xaden's signet is. I mean, we find that out in a couple pages. Or is he keeping her from being seen by the other marked ones?
I think it was him. The wrap around me part implies that the action is on behalf of the shadows. And we know that he can touch her with the shadows, so I totally think it was him.
I agree. I think it was him too, and I think he was protecting her from not being seen by the other marked ones.
Yes, and this was actually the second time that like shadows kind of thing was brought up in this chapter. The first time it's mentioned, it's within moments of Xaden arriving. Violet thinks, I move out of the patchy moonlight to the next branch over, cloaking myself in shadow. The cloaking myself implies that she's the one doing the action, not the shadows, like the one before. And I think that this is the moment Xaden would have been alerted of her presence by his shadows because she moved into them.
Oh my gosh. You see, you pointed it out, the difference of saying cloaking myself and being wrapped in the shadows.
What would tell us about this that he was the one doing the action? And I think that might be it. Now, I do wonder if Xaden reading Vi's intentions is limited to solely the moments her scalp prickles, because why wouldn't he have tried to read her intentions here as soon as he was alerted that she was in the shadows, or at whatever point? He knew at some point during the meeting, right? Because he knew to wait. So he had to have known from his shadows. That tells us that because we don't get a scalp prickle, unless he could read intentions without her feeling the scalp prickle. That's hard.
I'm glad we're on the same page because I had similar questions. And I have been wondering if everybody feels the scalp prickling sensation, because wouldn't there be more questions as to why people were feeling that? Like,
we may have even talked about that last episode. That has been driving me nuts. I want to know, and we won't know unless we get a POV that's not Xaden or Violet. And honestly, like right now, there's no other POV I want.
Right.
So I don't need to know it that, Rebecca Yaros, if you are listening, I do not need to know that badly.
Maybe Violet and Rhiannon will have a conversation, and Rhiannon's like, I just sometimes feel a weird scalp prickling. That's all. That's just a little conversation.
That's so cute. Oh my gosh. I have a question that just happened right in this moment. Does that mean that Xaden can read the intentions of dragons?
Oh my gosh, I don't know.
So that came from me thinking, well, maybe from Andarna, because Violet's in Andarna's mind. Andarna might be like, that's strange. I've always felt the scalp prickle. And then like connects it for us. But then that's when my mind jumped to, but can he even read the intentions of dragons? And if he can read the intentions of dragons, that's huge. That's like dragon secrets he could be tapping into.
Ooh, I think no, because that begs the question of, can Dane touch a dragon and see their recent memories? I mean, he can't get close enough to a dragon without being incinerated, but could he?
Well, I think you just pointed out how Rebecca could get away with it. But she's also, Rebecca, and I think we should keep this in mind every time we talk about signets, right? Rebecca said no two signets are the same. So she doesn't use the same parameters in which to like judge a signet in its limitations and abilities. But that's also a good point, especially considering that Dane may be able to grow to where he can see recent memories when he doesn't have to touch someone, like just from being across the room, the way that Xaden can read an intention. unless Xaden's is somehow limited to distance. There's so much we don't know. But oh my gosh, I want to know if he can read the intentions of dragons.
Excuse me, Rebecca Yaros, we have a question.
Ma'am, this is what I have to know.
I know that you do not listen to podcasts and care about other theories and stuff, but if we could make a request.
We could just sprinkle that in there for us, please. We're begging. Okay, anyways. Back to where we were. I also wonder and think that it is most likely that this was a test on Xaden's part of Violet. He was allowing her to hear this bit of information from their meeting, reading her intentions after, and seeing what she would do with it and whether she could be trusted. He knows he could kill her after everyone leaves, so there wasn't really much risk in letting her hear. And I also think he probably didn't want the marked ones to know she was up there in case, I don't know, it just wouldn't have made for as spicy of a scene that's coming up. But
or they would have more of a vendetta against her if they knew that she was spying on them, even though she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But at this point, I don't think he wanted to kill her. So good for Violet for keeping his secret.
I agree. I also appreciate about Violet that her first instinct was to assume positively of them. She tried to rationalize it being completely harmless before she started to wonder if it could be something bad that they were doing, which shows her instinct to see the best in people. And this time she was right. Now, Xaden also says that they have been meeting for 2 years. And I just have to say that now that we know his signet, this makes so much more sense, because how else would he have been able to get away with this?
It's the only way he could have gotten away with it, because they sneak out in groups of 3, which is not a crime, and meet all together and most likely wrapped in his shadows once they are all together.
Well, also him being able to see the intentions of other people if they are there to overhear, or he'd be able to see intentions of people coming if they were coming to kill him because they found out. Like, there's so many things about that helps. That makes so much sense for why he's even survived as long as he has.
So Gale could have warned him too if she heard of anyone coming as well.
Okay, this is really random, but I did not realize that Liam's hair was described as spiky blonde.
Oh my gosh.
What that is.
That's making me picture a 90s boy band member. Oh, goodness.
That's good. It's not how I pictured. I see him as like this golden retriever, like curly blonde locks.
Okay, that's how I pictured him too, until you said the spiky hair, and it was just giving Backstreet Boys.
That's so We also get a huge clue into how Navarre has manipulated history and the information they are telling the cadets and riders in Battle Brief about what's happening on the borders. When Xaden asked where the March Ones are struggling, one of them says, Battle Brief. It's not that I can't keep up, but the information. And then Xaden responds, you learn what they teach you. Keep what you know, but recite whatever they tell you. And Violet is really thrown off by this. And thinks to herself, the only things we're asked to recite are recent events and general knowledge of what's going on near the front lines. That's talking to us. That is telling us, hey, what Violet's being told is not true. But what the March Ones know is that the real enemies are the Venin, who are attacking everyone outside of the wards, and that the attacks from the Griffin Riders are because they need alloy daggers to defend their citizens, and even Navarians in Tyrandor, who are outside of the protection of the wards. But for the class, they are expected to reframe entirely to this false narrative that Navarre is the victim in the situation. And that's really horrible, especially given what they did to their parents.
It's so horrible and extremely hard, like knowing the truth, pretending that it's not real for a class and for your life, because they are trying to stay alive as well.
For this reason, I know Xaden is supposed to be a morally gray character, but I truly do not see him that way. This is a bit of a rant here, maybe, but I think it's important. He is 100% moral in the circumstances that were placed upon him. And instead of being only out for himself, which would have been somewhat understandable given what was done to him and his family, and I think would have actually made him more morally gray, but he didn't. This is where the sociologist in me comes out, because we look at the decisions that people make as influenced by social forces outside of their control that inform what they do. And I think that the social forces in Navarre at play here, the propaganda, the murder of the rebellion leaders, which are their parents, the decision on Navarre to be selfish and leave everyone else out, including part of their own country, unprotected, and then lie to their people. All of those social factors are what make up the situation that Xaden has really done the best he can in, better than I think anyone else would have. And I will defend Xaden till the day I die. Okay, that's it.
I would like that as a soundbite. My ringtone, my text tone. Anyways, I totally agree. And I also don't see him as morally gray because his intentions are to help people and he's doing his best. And there's nothing gray about that because he's actually the good guy in my mind. He's done some bad things because of this situation he is put into, but he is doing his best.
Yeah, and we'll get into, especially as we go through the chapters toward the end of this book and in Iron Flame, where I could see arguments for being morally gray, but I also will justify them to the best of my ability.
We are totally unbiased here. I also believe that Violet has never actually hated Xaden, and she's had that I hate that I like you thing with him this whole time.
Oh, 100%. And she seems to really only hold fear that he would kill her, but no true resentment. And at that point would have been about him, like, killing her brother. I was surprised to see she just had googly eyes from the very beginning. And I do not blame her. But also, okay.
Oh, and then she just keeps seeing good things. His meeting with the younger marked ones showed her that he cares about his people and that he's going to do whatever he can to help them survive.
This is where I fell in love with Xaden Ryerson.
Not whenever he said, hardly.
Okay, but I didn't see that until a reread. So it really was this chapter was like, oh, I can't put this down.
And then this goes into when Violet said, I don't want to find a single thing about Xaden Ryerson admirable, but here he is being all annoyingly admirable. Asshole. Oh, and it made me laugh because it's the feeling of wanting to hate someone and just not being able to.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the kid, whenever Xaden's talking to the marked ones and he's asking how he can help, and then the kid has a breakdown about not wanting to be there, I read that and I said, me. That would be me.
You know what? I had thought that is probably where he's supposed to be morally gray, because he's like being incompassionate for this kid, but I don't see it that way. Like, yes, I'm sad for the kid, and maybe I've become hardened by the writer's quadrant myself, but I think given the circumstances, again, if he does that for all 107 marked ones, like, he's not going to be able to help anyone. And so he really does, like, only have X amount of time.
Right. And they don't have a choice to be there. Xaden doesn't have a choice. The other marked ones doesn't have a choice, and he can't help them out of there. So I feel like he's just being blunt. Like, you don't want to be helped. I can't help you. You're going to die if you don't try.
Yeah. And then we get pleasantly blindsided. Pun intended. With Xaden's first signet. And this is how I learned what a shadow daddy is. Because I didn't know. I've never read a book with that. And apparently it's a thing.
It is a thing. This is the first time I had ever heard of a shadow daddy too.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes me feel a little more in the know.
I love that you pointed it out though.
How do you not? So he's a shadow wielder, which is an incredibly rare signet that's highly coveted in battle, able to disorient entire drifts of griffins, if not take them down, depending on the signet strength. That's what Violet tells us as readers. And it tells us so much, including that Xaden's first signet is just as badass as his second. And the part about taking down entire drifts of griffins was actually foreshadowing Xaden taking down hordes of a wyvern, also indicating the strength of his signet compared to other shadow wielders who were not able to take down entire drifts of griffins.
Griffins? Question mark?
I really loved how much he used his shadows in this chapter. How it can take the shape of things, like, I'm going to say this as non-sexually as I can, fingers, to pluck daggers. How they curl around him as he walks. I love when powers are used, and boy, does he use them. Okay, I'll stop. I'm done.
Oh my gosh. The way you said that. But
you just wait for the spicy chapters. We'll put a content warning.
Yeah, we have a content warning on all of these. Oh, goodness. But yes, he is so skilled in his signet. And I love the mental image of a literal shadow hand in a non-dirty way, or shield, or whatever shape he is using to do what he wants to do.
Honestly, I think out of all of the signets used so far in the series, his is the most utilized consistently. And his can do the most actionable things and like various things. Whereas Violet is just now learning the things she can do. Would love, you called it a novella?
Novella,
love a Xaden POV of when he first started channeling his signets, both of them. I would love, because then we'd actually get to see from his perspective, like really what it started as, how his signets grew. That I know I'm a power girly. Like I love the magic and the abilities of it all. And so I really hope that Rebecca, I know that we're in the first 2 books where Violet is really only just now getting her signet, learning about her second one, which she has not learned about yet. So I really hope that as she grows through her power, we get to see it utilized more often and in various ways.
And I think Xaden has a little bit of an advantage of being able to utilize his power, because his power can also do small things as well as big things. Violet's first signet is lightning wielding. She can't so much do anything besides huge strikes of lightning and like really control where they're going. So it's not something that she can utilize as much. I think his like leans itself more towards being able to utilize it often.
Yes, you were exactly right. I had a thought when you said that. You've not read the Red Queen series.
No.
Okay. So that was my favorite series before this. It didn't have like the romance I was going after, which is why this one has like taken over my entire life. But for a long time, because of the powers, that was my favorite series. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, jump ahead a couple minutes here. In the Red Queen, well, do you want the spoiler about her power?
Yep.
It's the same. She's a lightning wielder.
Oh.
And so I'll get to this on the chapter that we actually talk about this, but she uses it in different ways. She's like more electricity oriented. And I was just thinking as you were saying that we don't have electricity in Navarre.
Right.
Even their lights are magic mage lights.
Yeah.
So I know it's been explained that Violet's is like pure energy. So I was kind of expecting her to be able to do things with electricity.
Oh, there's another book, and I'm not going to tell you what the name is, but the main character also has this ability to do fires and make them, but it's like also grown to not just make like a bonfire. It takes a lot of energy to have this like fire, because she can make it accidentally burn out people. But she gets it to where she can do a lot with it, kind of a similar way. So I'm excited to see Violet really hone in on this.
Absolutely. I just really, really want to see these signets utilized to their full capacity. And I know we're just getting started, so I'll be patient. Being patient. Jumping right back into this scene, taking a moment to throw this in, I found the entire scene where Vi throws the daggers at Xaden so hot. The way he calls her fascinating and then violent for the first time, swoon. And then the moment he tells her to try that on Jack Barlow to make him think twice, I'm going to come back to this. We're going to come back to this.
Oh, it was so hot. And then whenever he's not only hot, right? Like, ooh, spicy, nice moment.
Flirty.
Yes. He's also trying to help her save herself, which made me fall in love.
Yes. If it would have just been flirtatious and not that intention behind it, I don't think it would be as hot as we find it. At least not for me. Right. So, yeah, I think you nailed it. Interestingly, this is the first moment we get where Xaden is fixated for a moment on Vi's hair. And this makes me wonder whether he knows something about it that he hasn't told Vi yet.
He knows so many things that he hasn't told Violet yet. That's the entirety of Iron Flame.
I know it to some extent. It has to continue a little, but God dang, if that continues through Onyx Storm, it's hard to read. I cannot listen to him say one more time that if you just ask, I'll tell you, and then he doesn't fucking tell her.
Yeah.
Anyways. So, of course, our good to her core heroine makes the right compassionate decision not to turn the marked ones in for gathering. But we have to talk about the whole 3 or more thing. Violet contradicts herself in this chapter. She knows about the marked ones and how they can't gather in groups of 3 or more, but in the Parapet chapter, when she's signing in, Mira has to explain the marked ones relics to her, and she thinks, quote, the only relics I've ever heard of are when a dragon uses magic to mark the skin of their bonded rider. But those relics are a symbol of honor and power, which you pointed out last episode, Karen, and generally in the same shape of the dragon who gifted them. These marks are swirls and slashes that feel more like a warning than a claiming. This has to be a writing inconsistency or something. I don't know. Because the epigraph specifically mentions the rebellion relics, which I'm making an informed assumption that Violet has read these, and that's how she knows and is saying to Xaden that she knows that she's been here longer than he has at Basgiath. It mentions the rebellion relics and the 3 marked ones gathering as an act of seditious conspiracy. It doesn't make sense that she didn't know, but now she does know this information about them. Like,
that's
I don't know.
So true. My brain's kind of malfunctioning thinking about this. But yeah, maybe it's something that she's learned since being there, even though it's not something that we're told.
But then she says her reasoning is, I've been here longer than he has. Like,
yeah, it could definitely just be an inconsistency. I am not sure.
Well, on that, the rule is specifically that the marked ones can't be in groups of 3 or more. But why does Xaden say that 3 of them training together won't draw attention? And then he sends them back to their rooms in groups of 3.
I understood it as more than 3. So they can be 3. There just can't be more than that.
I thought that as well. But I looked back and it says 3 or more specifically.
Oh.
I don't know. And again, like, giving some leadway here, some of the questions we're going to ask, Fourth Wing was written, I believe, in 2, 3, or 4 months. Yeah. So there are things that maybe fell through the cracks, and that's okay. We still love the book. Yeah. So, if we're doing this deep dive, we're trying to figure out the characters, the lore, the things, the theories. There may be some times where we can say that's probably just, it's probably not a theory. It's just inconsistency.
So true.
But I would like to take a moment to get into Xaden's mind as best we can here in this scene. So Xaden knows that Violet now holds life-changing, dangerous information about him. And while he's gotten some of the information about her, that she's seemingly a good person, he still doesn't know if she can be completely trusted. He's clearly having to consistently contemplate keeping his deal with General Sorrengail or killing Violet. And I think that's what he was debating while she was in the tree and after when he searched for her intentions, because had Violet intended to tell her mom or anyone about the Marked Ones meeting, Xaden would be dead anyway, which is what would stop him from killing her knowing his deal with Lilith. So he needed Violet to say she wouldn't tell and to mean it so that he and the Marked Ones could live. Remember, Xaden took responsibility for all of them. So if he dies specifically by doing something against Navarre, they all die. That's my understanding, at least. There was a lot at stake for him in this scene.
Right. And he not only doesn't want to die for his own sake, but I really believe he doesn't want to die because he's the one protecting all of the Marked Ones, and then they would be killed too if he was caught doing something bad or illegal. There was so much at stake and so much trust he put into Violet in this moment.
Exactly. And I think you pointed out something. It may be the case that if one of them do something wrong, that he would die, and maybe they don't all die if he does. I'm not sure. We'll look at that. But no matter what, yes, he's holding this responsibility for them. They likely would die without him and his guidance because he's the oldest one.
Like, if he got caught doing something bad, I don't know that they would kill all of the Marked Ones, but then he could be thinking, who will protect them?
It's like, if he was caught smuggling out the daggers, would they have assumed that all Marked Ones were now a risk to Navarre and just kill him anyway? That's kind of where I was thinking it was a given that they would all die as well. But luckily, they're out at the point in the future. But if we're thinking about this scene specifically, that had to be a lot going through his mind, a lot at stake. And for him to be so flirtatious, so smooth when all of this is going on.
He can multitask.
Love a man who can multitask and wields shadows. Now, the way this whole chapter ended was perfection. Now get back to your bed before your wing leader realizes you're out after curfew. Shut the fuck up. Are you kidding me?
You're my wing leader. Oh, he's already gone.
I loved that line. I think I read that whole section multiple times the first time, and I was like, okay, Violet, catch up to me because I'm in love. You're like, guys, I'm sorry. I will be insufferable when it comes to Xaden. I am very critical as well. Like, I try to be at least, of him. Most of that goes toward Dane. But I love a good moment to just swoon. So thanks for joining me in that.
We are both annotating our books, and one of Hannah's categories is swoon melt moments.
Romantic. Yeah, I have 17, maybe 18 now, different categories, which is super helpful actually for a deep dive, but that's my favorite one.
I figured. All saved for Xaden.
Literally. Anyway, switching to a topic I really don't even want to talk about, but here we are. Fucking Dane. I did not remember Violet being this down bad for Dane. She thinks to herself, seeing him is the best part of my day. And then shortly after, his mouth curves in a grin that makes me wish it were his business, though, when they're talking about her sex life not being his business. Okay, girl, that's not saying much when you are in this brutal hellhole. She just needs like a friends with benefits or something. Like, take notes from Rhiannon's coping mechanisms, because this whole falling for Dane, or thinks she is.
Yeah.
All right, let me take one single moment to say, as hard as we are, a quick refresh that Rebecca Yarros has said Dane was supposed to be the love that she thought that she wanted. So this is her showing us this.
But also, is seeing him the best part of her day? I feel like she always leaves mad and upset that he's pushing her towards the Scribe Quadrant.
Whoa, good point. I don't know why I didn't even think of that. Yeah.
Right? I think we willfully ignored her liking him so much, and we just said, ew, gross. Now show me Xaden.
Yes, please. I don't want to hear anything about Dane. Just show me Zayden. Back to Violet. I loved how she thought to volunteer for breakfast duty. Like all of the cadets have to volunteer for something, like pick one of the duties. And Dane specifically says, like, I'm really surprised you chose this one. Like nobody really wants this. And it was brilliant. So she was doing it so she could poison her opponents. That is so clever.
There's no cheating at Baskai or college.
Just poison people. But she doesn't poison them to kill them, which is an important thing to note about our girl. But just enough to knock them down a peg.
Right. Dane also tells Violet that she needs to lay low with Jack Barlow, and she thinks about the difference of the advice Zayden gave her whenever he told her to just throw a few daggers at his head. This just continues our thoughts about Dane trying to baby her and shelter her and not actually help her get better like Zayden is starting to.
Yeah, and unfortunately that doesn't change much in these chapters, or really the coming ones.
Okay, now we are in Dragon class, and for the sake of focusing on analysis of all of the other info packed into these chapters, we won't dive deep into each of the dragons today, but we would love to do a dragons bonus episode. If that's something you guys are interested in, please let us know.
Dragon class is my favorite class of the classes that they take, and that's important to note because I've not read a dragon book or been a dragon girly before. But I love learning about them, and I wish we got to learn more. I also get, though, that knowledge on the dragons is limited as they keep lots of secrets. But one important piece of information that we got from the last set of chapters that fits better here is why the dragons even chose to bond humans at all. So Violet explains this best when she thinks, if they, the dragons, didn't need us puny humans to develop signet abilities from bonding, and to weave the protective wards they power around Navarre, I'm pretty sure they'd eat us all and be done. Fair. But they like protecting the Vale, the valley behind Basgaia, the dragons call home, from merciless griffins. Yeah, no, that's not the case. Venom. And we like living, so here we are in the most unlikely of partnerships. Now, Rebecca has described this in an interview that I can't seem to find again, but I will try my best. That dragons don't have opposable thumbs, and that's why they need humans to weave the wards and to fight the venom. I thought that was a cute little excerpt from her.
They need each other whether they like it or not. Yeah. I love that she said that, though. So this year, there's only 100 dragons who are willing to bond, which is 37 fewer dragons than the previous year. Orly asks if the numbers affect the wards, and Professor Kaori says that they aren't sure and that it has never affected the wards before, but that they are seeing an increase in breaches now.
Yeah, I don't think they affect the wards. At this point, Kaori and Violet didn't know the alloy was being taken by weakening them. And I think that little excerpt of him explaining, well, I can't tell you they're not, is both him not knowing and for us readers to still be able to question if it's the case instead of him just shutting it down, being like, oh, it's never done that before. I think it was giving us more context. But there are several theories about why less and less dragons are bonding, including a really cool one from Sean.rs16 on TikTok, where he thinks that dragons aren't bonding because they're already bonded to riders that turned venom. He cited Iron Flame chapter 7, where Violet asks if the reason dragons are bonding less and less is because they know about the venom. And Taryn responds, yes, humans aren't the only ones keeping secrets.
Oh, what?
Now, I like this theory, but I think it just as easily could mean that the dragons are upset by what Navarre is doing and are choosing not to partake. Which I think is what Taryn did, though there is the theory that Naolan is venom and is still bonded to Taryn, but then how would he bond a second rider? But it's also been implied that dragons choose specifically to bond just one, but they could have bonded two. That's in there somewhere. So, like, that's what makes it set up to be like, oh, is that the case? Anyways, I believe that Rebecca Yarros has insinuated that the dragons are upset about what's going on, and that's why they're not choosing to bond on a
Yeah.
panel, but don't quote me on that. Importantly, she has more directly insinuated that dragons can choose to unbond from riders that turn venom. So I feel like the dragons would be less likely to stay bonded to their riders like Jack for exactly what happened to Bade. And this is why we are all so scared for what this means for Sigale and Xaden. But
Oh,
again, that's for a future
I know.
episode.
But I kind of, with this theory, I think that what you said is probably more accurate. I love the theory that TikTok shared. I do think it might be that the dragons have a choice and they are upset with what is happening.
I think it makes sense. And the more that we learn about the Empyrean, the government of the dragons, which again, we have to remember this book series is called the Empyrean series. Its focus is the dragons, not the puny humans. So, what does that mean? Were the first two books just a setup in the humans world, and we're going to be expanding our knowledge way more, which to some extent we will, but how big is the shift to the dragons?
Ooh.
And then what does that mean for the characters that we've come to love that are puny humans?
Wow.
Whew. Anyways.
Oh, goodness.
On the note of Xaden and Sigale, in Dragon Class, Professor Kaori describes Sigale in interesting detail, saying that, quote, ruthless does not begin to describe her, nor does she abide by what we assume to be what the dragons consider law. She even bonded the relative of one of her previous riders, which you all know is typically forbidden. But Sigale does whatever she wants, whenever she wants. First of all, love that for her.
Yeah.
And I have even more thoughts on top of these. So I'm going to tell you what I already was thinking. Then this is huge significantly for our story. And either one, this is just referencing and setting up Sigale being so down to help Xaden smuggle the daggers to the Griffin Flyers. Or this is setting up something even bigger specifically with the Empyrean, the Dragon Council, possibly for future books. It could also be both. And what I'm saying here is specifically her not abiding by the rules that they assume that is the dragon's laws. But then I just had a thought. One, it's also telling us that it's foreshadowing that Xaden is bonded to her and one of his relatives was bonded first, setting up for his second signet. But we didn't know like the exact details of that just yet. Is that what they're referring to here as what they assume is dragon's law? Because it says, which you all know is typically forbidden. Forbidden by who? Because humans don't tell dragons who they can and can't bond.
Right.
Hence, Andarna and her getting two dragons, right? So I've already wondered this, but I didn't think of it until just now. Is that law that they're not supposed to bond directly in the direct descendant line of their previous rider the rule that Sigale was breaking here?
Oof. I don't know whose rule it was. I feel like it could make sense because if they bond to somebody who's related to their previous rider, maybe that's a higher chance of them to die whenever their rider dies, because they don't always die when their rider dies, but if the bond is really strong, they do. Maybe it's more of a protection that is like in order for them. I don't know.
Well, I feel like we're going to find out in Onyx Storm. It's just one of those things. I know that we ask a lot of questions, and honestly, that's the nature of a deep dive of an unfinished series, right? So we're just going to keep throwing all these questions at you. If you have an epiphany from any of our epiphanies and our questions, please share them with us.
Yes.
We've got that Discord, so we can easily just jump on over there and keep this going.
Right. I do have one more thought about that.
Yes, please.
Do we think that whenever Sigale bonded Xaden, they had that like a big meeting like they did for Violet bonding two dragons?
Not that the humans would have known about, but likely that seems to be their, I would say absolutely, if it is considered, they word it very strangely because they imply that we don't really know if it's their laws, but if it was a guideline for dragons from the Empyrean that they're not to do this, and then Sigale did it anyway. They probably did meet about it, but again, this shows in here something else has happened before Xaden, because Professor Kaori doesn't really realize this. I feel like something else happened, unless that is what he's referring to. I don't know. I don't know.
Anyways, continuing on with Dragon class, Jack again decided to be the most annoying and presumptuous person ever. We can already tell that he's so power hungry, setting up for why he became Venom. And then he finds out about Terran and is like, I want that one.
Yeah. And as they're showing Terran, Jack says, best of both worlds. He looks like a killing machine. I love this contrast, not in terms of Jack, but Jack is after a dragon for power and seemingly violence toward and over other people. But Terran chose Violet because she defended Andarna from a killing machine, Jack, who was never after power, who never thought she would bond a dragon, and then bonded too. For what it's worth, Jack did have a purpose here. On that, I had a feeling the moment I read about Terran and how Jack reacted to him that he would be Violet's dragon, or really that she would be his human. But I had a feeling they were going to bond.
You have such a great ability to see ahead in moments like this. And I wish that I did, because I did not put this together until after Terran and Violet bonded.
Oh, okay. But I love a good surprise. So it's always a balance. In my first read, I wasn't looking for foreshadowing and Easter eggs and stuff like that. There were just things that felt a little more obvious to me. And I thought, they're really hyping this guy up. He can't just be a dragon that doesn't show up at Threshing like they're saying it. I thought he was going to show up at presentation. And then we got this golden dragon, and I was like, oh, maybe that is one? Then why was the other one so significant? Does Jack actually bond him? So that's where my mind went, just like questions that I was engaging with the text with, but not like this deep.
Yeah.
I did want to note that black dragons here, first of all, are so hyped up. Again, as I was just saying, they're considered the rarest, smartest, most discerning, cunning, and black morning stars specifically are the deadliest. That's Terran. At least for Terran, though, they also have the best humor. I've not been in the minds of many dragons, but there's no topping Terran.
True. Yeah, and he has to have a good sense of humor with Andarna and Violet.
They're such a great trio. They balance so well. Again, all things we'll get into as we go through it, but
yeah.
Whoa, did I catch something here that I'm so excited to share. Professor Kaori says that if it weren't for Terran, Navarre probably would have lost the Tirish rebellion. I did not catch this in my first read.
I didn't catch it my second.
This is complex, okay? Because now Terran is fighting 1000% no hesitation on the side of the revolution, led by the kid of the Tirish rebellion leaders. Also, Terran may have won Navarre the rebellion, but he lost his rider in the process. I just got chills.
Oh.
I wonder how much of losing Naolan and whatever he found out there at the end of Naolan's life is why he went into hiding. So not just that it affected him so much that he lost his rider. Even though he is particularly sensitive to that, it makes me feel like there's more at play here. Refusing to bond another rider and then choosing one with a heart likely to side with the revolution. I don't think it's about the revolution. I think it's about what's right. And right now, the thing that is right with the context that Violet and Terran know is that they need to defend people from Venom. So I'm not saying it's about the revolution. I'm just saying that there's so much here. I also love that Terran is that, you know, he is described as the smartest breed, most discerning. He is able to discern a lot of this propaganda that the humans are fed. And it's so, oh, there's so much to tease out in there. And we will as we get through the books and pick up on more things about it. But there's lots of theories that I have swirling in my mind.
Oh,
Clearly.
that just made me think that maybe the Tyrus Rebellion had to happen for the greater good in the future, and maybe he actually has been on that side even back then, and even though he's the reason that Navarre won that.
Ooh, are you thinking like a precognition thing here? Like he would know that? Or are you saying it just dominoes fell how they were?
Dominoes fell how they were. Not that maybe he has precognition, but maybe he could just sense, because he is discerning, that this needed to happen. Even though it was painful, even though he lost his rider and everything, for Navarre to win for the eventual greater good. I don't know.
I don't want to get too far off, but we need to look at when the Venin really started populating back. Because it's been, 600 years with this, and then 400 years since their history was erased. So I'm assuming in that time it was talking about Venin and stuff like that. But it's been quite a long time, and it's only just now happening in Violet's timeline that all this is unraveling, and Taryn is 100 years old. So we do know that context. Maybe it was only in the last couple years, I guess it would have to be at least 5, take it back to wherever the rebellion started, which I think it only lasted a year, if I'm not mistaken. That is when the Venins started to populate a lot more, come out of their mountains, I believe, is where they're at, and then attacking citizens and specifically Tyrandor, which is why they chose to rebel. And then the dragons might have had limited knowledge on that at first. Specifically the dragons in Navarre, because we don't know about the dragons other places, nor do we know how big this world is. Okay, so who knows if there's other Empyreans out there. Basically, maybe Taryn just didn't have the information here and made decisions with that. And then now that he has more information, that's why I think that he found out something different when Naolan died, or around that time, that made him say, I'm not doing this again. I'm not fighting. I'm not winning this war for the wrong people. But it also goes to show that if anyone is going to win this revolution, which it is now, because that was a rebellion, if anyone's going to win this revolution, it is the dragon that won Navarre against the rebellion. And one of the most powerful riders of her generation.
Wow.
With a fucking lightning wielding signet. Anyways. Whew. Another woe. I knew that a signet was determined by the unique chemistry between a dragon and their rider, and that the more powerful the dragon, the more powerful the signet. I got that. What I did not catch until this third reread is that the stronger the bond between a dragon and a rider, the stronger the signet. Oh my God.
Wow.
I literally gasped when I read this, and I'm going to try my best to explain what the difference is here. Not only did Violet bond the rarest, smartest, deadliest, and one of the most powerful dragons we know of. Okay? That already makes her up here. Her bond with Tarn is unmatched because of how deeply he bonds, and has said so much to the point that if Violet dies, Tarn goes with her.
Oh, and the faith that Taryn and Sigale have to have in Violet, knowing that if she dies, Taryn dies. If he dies, Sigale dies. I also did not catch the stronger bond, the stronger the signet thing. And that is just like super important to know moving forward. Not only for our knowledge of like Violet, but also the other powerful riders that we see.
Absolutely. I'm surprised that Sigale would be okay with Tarn bonding or encourage it. Though I think it's implied that it was entirely Tarn's decision. To bond with Violet in the clearing, especially considering that, like, in several ways, she is considered by others as weak. This also makes me curious about Violet's bond with Andarna. They already have such an intense and deep emotional bond. It's so beautiful to get to see as she grows. And I wonder if bonding a Feathertail, specifically in the manner that Violet did in protecting her, which is already like trauma bond, but on steroids in the best way, and that Indarna waited 600 years specifically to bond Violet, makes for an even stronger bond than Violet could even have with Tairn. An already unmatched bond.
Oh, I love that you brought this up. And I think their bond is going to be extremely strong. And I'm just itching to know what the second signet Violet will get from that bond will be. And then
I know.
Am I on is Violet's second signet is going to be precognition train? I might be. Just because Indarna knew. She looked ahead 600 years.
I don't know. I have to look at the evidence because a lot of people have done some really cool stuff in looking at signets. I'd have to look, but someone had said at some point, I think I just scrolled past it, but someone had said that it seemed like Indarna had some sort of sense. And I believe that comes from her moments of saying, I am where you need me. How does she know in that moment she needs it? But then also, why would she not share that with Violet?
Right.
That's where, like, I don't understand if either of them have a power, why they would not share that with Violet. Anyways, we also get more context about Tairn's first rider, Naolin, who we talked about earlier. And there are many theories about this, one that I'm particularly keen on believing, which is that they were lovers, which is why Naolin sacrificed himself and would make it even harder for Tairn to watch Violet do the same for Xaden.
I can't think about the Violet doing it for Xaden part, but back to Naolin and Brennan. I've heard this theory too, and I'm totally on board with it. It just makes so much sense. And I know Brennan was super important, and his signet is super powerful, and it was needed and necessary, but I just don't know if that would be the reason that Naolin saved him. I feel like it would have been a much more personal reason.
It adds a layer of emotion to the fact that he did sacrifice himself. And I think that especially we learn with Violet, you know when you're getting close to burnout. And Violet kept pushing anyways. And she said she didn't care because she was trying to save the people she loves.
Yeah.
And I think that that might be an overarching theme of this series because Rebecca Yarros has said a theme is what will people do for power? And I think that the question for Violet and Xaden and Tairn and the people who have love in their hearts instead of this power hungriness is what will they do to protect those they love from power?
Oof.
And that, I know I just also, that first of all is one of the reasons that I'm obsessed with this series.
Yeah.
And I think it just fits. I know that I said earlier that we would bring this back up, so I just want to touch on it really quickly. Karen, you brought up a really good point about menders not being able to heal or mend themselves and what that can do for them mentally, at least the extent that we know that their signets have limitations. This is what I wanted to bring up. Imagine Brennan knowing that he cannot mend himself and he is dying. And then possibly his lover, who is a siphon, takes his power to then make it possible for him to essentially heal himself.
Wow.
Why did that just make me emotional?
Oh my gosh.
On the same topic, but switching gears a little bit, Professor Kaori says that Naolin, quote unquote, attempted to use that power to revive a fallen rider, which didn't work because there's no signet capable of resurrection, and depleted himself in the process. He burned out and died next to that rider. That is what we know from Professor Kaori. But we know that Brennan is alive. So does this mean that there is a signet capable of resurrection if it is strong enough? Either this or Brennan was not as close to death as everyone believes. What would be the point in that? What would be the point in adding this resurrection thing in other than for us to maybe just doubt that Brennan would be alive? But we didn't need that.
Oh, it's such a good point. And then also, Jack was dead and brought back. So I think that points to it actually being possible. I mean, we don't know how close to death Jack was either.
Well, okay, so that is actually an important distinction that Rebecca Yarros has addressed in interviews, specifically around fans wanting Liam to be brought back. And I'll see if I can find the exact one, but I think that it was Entertainment Weekly. She says Jack was never supposed to be dead. In fact, she left a clue for us that his name was never read off of the death roll. He was set up to come back the whole time. If you're talking about specifically like how he didn't die as Venom on the mountain.
He wasn't Venom at this point, but yeah, whenever Violet struck the lightning and on the mountain.
He was Venom at that point.
Before we knew, though.
My theory with that is that Jack was not actually that close to being dead, and he somehow used his Venom powers to like basically shield. I don't know the extent, but I think that that's why he didn't die in the collapse of the mountain.
Yeah.
But we'll get more into that in that chapter episode. I had another thought, and I had a lot of thoughts for these chapters, as you can all clearly tell. But about Brennan's near-death moment when Naolan died, it does make me wonder who saw this happen. How did Brennan even get away? But then right after that, Professor Kaori hits us with, quote, sometimes it's hard for a writer with the signet that powerful to accept its limits. After all, bonding makes you a writer, but resurrecting someone from the dead? Now that makes you a god. I somehow don't think that Malik takes kindly to a mortal treading on his territory. Whoa. Okay. There's so much in that, first of all, but it's really doubling down on the resurrection thing and invoking Malik, saying that it would make them a god to be able to resurrect. What is that telling us? Again, so many things swirling. I'm going to let that marinate.
Yep.
Maybe Naolan really did resurrect and Malik took his life for it. I don't know. That it doesn't line up with Rebecca Yarros' philosophy on death and keeping her characters dead. As she said in panels and interviews, that would lower the stakes of when characters die if you could easily just bring them back. So that's what makes me think resurrection's not a possible thing. But again, why is it mentioned? Why is this emphasized so much? I don't know.
Wow. You and I talked a bit about will the gods ever like come more into play and will we learn a lot more about them? And we kind of talked about that on this episode as well. This is a super interesting train of thought. Ooh, I'm kind of shook.
There's just so many things behind it. And I have to add this on. When talking about approaching Tairn, Professor Kaori said that, quote, the only way you'd ever be near him is if you're in the Veil, which you won't be because you'd be incinerated before you ever got through the gorge. Then it reads, from Violet's perspective, the pale redhead across the circle from me shifts in her seat and tugs her sleeve down to cover her rebellion relic. Now, I've read a theory somewhere a while back that said maybe this implies that the Marked Ones have been to the Veil, but I actually think this was a reference to how the Marked Ones' parents died. It's kind of foreshadowing us, giving us a clue there was something more here. They died by dragon fire, which activated the protection runes that the Marked Ones were holding in their hands, giving them the relic. This was probably a triggering moment for this particular red-headed Marked One, where she hears about the potential of being incinerated by a dragon for going to the Veil, which then made her cover her rebellion relic.
I have not seen that theory.
Well, the second one is mine, but the first one, yes.
Yeah. That was such a small moment, it seemed like. She just kind of pulled her sleeve, covered the rebellion relic, but I had wondered why.
Following this, Jack says that someone should ask him again, talking about asking Tairn if he'd be willing to bond again. This demonstrates a complete disregard and a lack of respect that Jack has for the hierarchy of the dragons here. Dragons are not simply to be asked again, they make their own decisions. As Rebecca Yarros has said in this series, the dragons are not the pets, the humans are. Which I love.
I love that. Ugh, Jack doesn't respect them at all, and it honestly makes me question to how he bonded a dragon in the first place. Because I get that he's ruthless, and we're told that the dragons like that, but he doesn't revere them like he should. I don't understand.
It definitely shows a flaw that is not supposed to be there by our characters' understandings of the dragon's ability to discern and make choices, as Taryn says, that they're not embarrassed by.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really good question, especially for the reason that happened to Bade. Like, when you choose a rider who is power hungry and who is that ruthless, what does that equate to?
Yeah.
When your power is not enough for them.
Oof. Wow.
So,
moving on to page 97, Professor Kaori says to Violet, I taught both your siblings. Brennan was a spectacular rider and a good man. Mira is shrewd and gifted in a seat when it comes to riding, but you're smarter than both of them. From what I've seen of you helping your friend study in the commons every night, it seems you might be more compassionate too. Don't forget that. Violet brushes this off and says that these things won't help her when it comes to threshing, and he responds with, they choose for reasons they don't see fit to share with us, and not all strength is physical, Violet. This is what we've been talking about with all the things that we love about Violet and her character.
mm-hmm.
She is so strong in ways that are not physical, and it's just foreshadowing because her compassion does end up helping her at threshing.
It absolutely does. And it also, I really love this moment as well because it put into words that what I had personally seen in Violet that was becoming slightly frustrating for her to constantly call herself weak and act like she was unworthy of a dragon. She had kind of been fed this perfect idea of a rider by her rider family members, so this was really refreshing to read. It also shows that Violet didn't trust herself and had so many doubts about her own abilities before she ever got an actual signet ability. And that comes into play so much, especially in Iron Flame, even in her relationship with Xaden, her relationship with her friends, her dynamic with this rebellion and Navarre. It comes into play in every aspect of her experience, which is important. I think it sums it up greatly. Yes.
Yeah.
I did also want to point out one interesting bit of info that's in that excerpt that you just read out, specifically when Professor Kaori says that Mira is gifted in the seat when it comes to riding. No wonder she was so shocked and concerned when she found out Violet couldn't keep her seat.
Oh, so
it was
true.
Something she never had an issue with. She was exceptionally good at it. She cannot relate even slightly to not being able to keep your seat. So when she reacted with such oh my God, what? Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that must have come easily to Mira.
We jump to the challenges on the sparring mat, and oh my goodness, the satisfaction that this scene gives me every damn time. First, a big fuck you to Dane. I was so happy to see Violet step up and actively defend herself, taking Xaden's advice to assert herself rather than Dane's blend in and be quiet approach. I also loved seeing Jack put in his place, though personally I think she could have aimed a little higher between the legs. He does not need to reproduce.
Hard agree. And I love that it's a common theme here for her to go for his balls. It's so funny to me.
I think it's a great analogy that she knows this is partly about his ego.
100%.
But most of all, I live for the moment that Xaden and Violet share after she throws the daggers following his advice. She thinks, there's no ignoring the prickle at my scalp, and I let my gaze shift to meet Xaden's. My heart does that damn stuttering thing again. As if he'd sent shadows straight through my ribs to squeeze the organ. He lifts his scarred brow, and I swear there's a hint of a smile on his lips as he leaves. Shut up right now. I cannot.
Oh my goodness. Oh,
I could talk about that scene for forever, so we're going to move on for the sake of time. Much against my will.
yeah.
And the sparring continues for weeks with Violet poisoning her opponents until, boom, Xaden and another icy, prickly scalp, which we will be getting to next episode. Sorry to
Oh,
leave you guys
yeah.
on a cliffhanger, but we're not done with this one yet. Before hopping on over to the Healer's Quadrant, let's take a moment to discuss the epigraphs in this section of chapters. Now, the first epigraph for chapter 5, this one's a big one, which is why we sectioned it off this way, because there's so much context for both stories. Quote, knowing I am in direct disagreement with General Melgren's orders, I am officially objecting to the plan set forth in today's briefing. It is not this general's opinion that the children of the rebellion's leaders should be forced to witness their parents' executions. No child should watch their parents put to death. The Tirish Rebellion, an official brief for King Tari by General Lilith Sorrengail.
This is something I totally missed in my first 2 reads, and I think that it is so important to not overlook because General Sorrengail is not as ruthless as we are led to believe. I feel like she was showing a small mercy towards these children. However, she is the one that put the slashes on Xaden's back.
I've been thinking about that exact thing a lot recently and why I still dislike Lilith, even though I did catch that on my first read. And so I had the indication that maybe she wasn't as bad, but like even a small mercy to me for the other things that she's done, specifically, we find out about the slashes, didn't do much for me, I suppose. But I believe that the slashes are actually a Tirish custom. So in Iron Flame, Imogen says that Xaden took responsibility for Violet when speaking to the assembly at Ryerson House. She says, quote, as brutal of a custom as it may be, and Xaden has a fresh scar added to his 107 for the marked ones. I think General Sorrengail tried to explain this to Violet as that it is a Tirish custom, a ritual of sorts, but Violet cut her off and said she'd want to know. So we lack that information.
I hope that it was a custom. I don't want General Sorrengail to be that cruel. I feel like I have a little bit of faith in her, especially with the context of Iron Flame. So I do not want her to be that cruel. So I hope that's what it is.
I think it'd be more interesting, and I think it makes her death in Iron Flame much more meaningful. But it's also okay to have a nuanced character.
Yeah.
A complex character that is in her own. Is that considered morally gray? I'm learning my verbiage. Maybe she didn't make the right decisions, but maybe her intentions were there.
Yeah.
Who knows?
All right. So chapter 6. It is my opinion that of all the signet powers writers provide, mending is the most precious, but we cannot allow ourselves to become complacent when in the company of such a signet, for menders are rare and the wounded are not. Major Frederick's Modern Guide for Healers.
So I think this was providing warning that menders have limitations, which in our overarching story here is important because the stakes of dying and people getting injured are so high, and it's so common that it would cheapen the stakes if everyone was easily able to get mended, no problem. In another series that I mentioned earlier, the Red Queen series, spoiler, if you haven't read it, skip ahead about 30 seconds, the characters spar to strengthen their powers, but they can be healed immediately after. So that is not nearly as dangerous as Gaiath and the Writer's Quadrant is meant to be, and that there is a reason for that. Navarre is more brutal than it has to be. That's the point. So importantly, this would also take away the representation of Violet's EDS, where if there was constantly a mender on standby at any given point, she could be close to fully able-bodied, which isn't really representation of her chronic illness. And we see ways around her access to Nolan when he's taken away for so long to try and heal Jack. So she doesn't have a constant access to a mentor. Those are my thoughts on that epigraph.
It's a good point. Chapter 7's epigraph says, "In the best interest of preserving peace with Navarre, no more than 3 cadets carrying rebellion relics may be assigned to any squad of any quadrant." Addendum 5.2, Basgiath War College Code of Conduct. In addition to last year's changes, marked ones assembling in groups of 3 or more will now be considered an act of seditious conspiracy and is hereby a capital offense. Addendum 5.3, Basgiath War College Code of Conduct.
So we've talked pretty deeply about the rebellion relics and how they came to be, that they weren't from Coda, they were from the protection rune from Leon's mom, and it was setting up what it meant for the March Ones meeting in Chapter 7. These epigraphs are specifically setting up for all of that. But importantly, these addendums were added all because Melgren cannot see the outcomes of battles if 3 or more are involved. I wonder when General Melgren first figured out that he had blind spots with the March Ones, because Xaden is the oldest, and he is in his 3rd year, so about 2 years since he first joined the Writers' Quadrant. And then probably 6 months before they get to threshing, and then up to 6 months before he can channel. So this is pretty recent. When were these addendums added?
I'm guessing he figured it out that first year with them being there.
Another novella idea.
We got you, Rebecca.
We'll just start listing them out for her. Chapter 8. There is an art to poison not often discussed, and that is timing. Only a master can properly dose and administer for effective onset. One must take into account the mass of the individual as well as the method of delivery. Effective uses of wild and cultivated herbs by Captain Lawrence Medina.
This epigraph sets us up for Violet's poisoning techniques, but also points out the limitations, setting up specifically for her timing to be off the 7th time she tries to poison her opponent, and then is met with Xaden as her challenger.
We won't always walk through every single one of these because we want to save more time for engaged discussion, but some of them are so full of Easter eggs that we have to. So, finally, our overarching and lingering questions sections, starting with asking some of the big questions we all have. First, how many times of scalp prickling, and what do we think Xaden was looking for? Now, we counted twice in this set of chapters, and the first time we covered briefly earlier is when Xaden is asking Vi if she's going to turn in the marked ones for assembling. She says to him, "I'm not going to tell," and then she thinks, "He looks at me like he's trying to see through me, and ice prickles my scalp." This is one of the more obvious moments for me of what he was looking for here. Is Violet telling the truth, or does she have the intention to turn them in? Can he trust her? This specific scalp prickle should have been so obvious in the first read, but honestly, I didn't even know that reading intentions was a power someone could have, and I did not know the extent that Rebecca Yarros would go to lay Easter eggs in just yet.
That is true. It feels obvious on our second read, but the first read, you're just like, you don't really realize. That's why we're counting. Also, the second one is at the end of chapter 8, after she throws daggers at Jack. And my thought is maybe he's just trying to see if the reason that she was going after Jack was to see if she was following his advice or to get her attention so he could give her approval.
Yeah, I was also thinking that it was either because he was trying to gauge if that was based on his advice and that was the smirk he got, or to see how she's handling Dane, or how she plans to handle her first challenge opponent, who she takes out easily because she poisoned him. So we're also going to be asking if there's any other moments where Xaden seems like he reads Violet's mind, and this one stood out to me. After Xaden leaves her under the tree, Violet thinks to herself, he didn't even ask what was in my satchel. So I think one of a couple things could be happening here. Either he read her intentions earlier on with no scalp prickle, or he picked up multiple intentions when he looked to see if she was telling the truth about not turning them in, or he just didn't care what she was doing, and I highly doubt that.
Oh, goodness. I kind of thought he didn't care, but I agree. He probably saw it before or just didn't want to know.
Or he picked up on her intention. I mean, we do know he's cared to some extent because he points this out to her later. And it's like, you're not going to get skilled if you don't. Next episode. You're not going to get skilled if you just keep poisoning your opponents. So he learned that at some point.
We also looked at when does Dane read memories, and we were fortunate enough not to come across any of these moments in this set of chapters. And that wraps up chapters 5 through 8. Thank you so much for listening. Our next episode will be a little bit shorter, covering both chapter 9s in each Violet and Xaden's point of view, as Hannah and I will be in London to see Taylor Swift at the Eras Tour. If you are enjoying this journey with us, we would super appreciate if you would leave us a review and share to all of your Fourth Wing friends.
As always, we encourage you to email us all of your thoughts, theories, and suggestions to dearfantasyreaderpod@gmail.com or drop them below if you are watching on YouTube. We want to hear it all. Or join our Discord to continue the conversation directly.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube and follow us over on TikTok and Instagram. We are currently doing a huge giveaway you don't want to miss out on.
Until next time, dearest fantasy readers, prepare yourselves for some steamy sparring as we continue our journey through the Empyrean series.